For 70 years, scholars thought they understood the Dead Sea Scrolls. Then, one scientist asked a question nobody had ever thought to ask. Not, what do they say, but what are they made of? That one question changed almost everything we thought we knew. I want to break down exactly what the old belief was, what the new science found, and why the difference matters so much. Let me start with the basics. The Dead Sea Scrolls are the oldest known copies of biblical texts that exist anywhere on Earth. Some of them are over 2,000 years old. Between 1947 and 1956, around 25,000 fragments were pulled from 11 caves near a site called Qumran, close to the Dead Sea in the Judean desert. These fragments came from nearly 1,000 separate manuscripts. They included early versions of Genesis, Isaiah, and Psalms. They also included rule books, hymns, and writings about the end of the world. The texts date from roughly 250 BCE to 68 CE. That is one of the most important stretches in all of human religious history, covering the rise of early Christianity and the final years of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. What I find remarkable is how well preserved they were. The dry desert air kept them intact for over 2 millennia. When scholars finally got access to them, the texts were readable. That was extraordinary. But reading them was only the beginning. The harder question was where they came from and who made them. The theory that took hold almost immediately pointed to a Jewish group called the Essenes. Ancient historians like Josephus had written about the Essenes. They were described as a strict, isolated religious community living in the Judean wilderness. They were devoted to scripture, to purity, and to the belief that God would soon judge the corrupt world around them. Qumran, the ruins sitting right beside the caves, looked exactly like the kind of settlement Josephus described. So the connection seemed obvious. The theory said the Essenes lived at Qumran, copied their religious texts there, and when Rome crushed the Jewish revolt in 68 CE, they sealed their library in the nearby caves to protect it. That explanation held for roughly 70 years. It was taught in universities. It appeared in museums. It was repeated in documentaries. To most people in the field, it was settled. But the evidence underneath that theory was always a little uncomfortable. And to me, once you look closely, the cracks are obvious. The scrolls contained wildly different versions of the same biblical books. 2 separate copies of the book of Jeremiah existed side by side. One was longer, with chapters in the familiar order. The other was noticeably shorter, with whole sections missing and chapters rearranged. The parchment quality varied enormously, from expertly prepared pieces to rough, almost crude material sitting right next to them. The writing ranged from highly skilled scribes to noticeably less practiced hands. Radiocarbon dating in the early 1990s showed that some scrolls were older than the Qumran settlement itself, and nobody had a clean answer to the most basic question. Why would one tight, disciplined religious group keep multiple contradictory versions of its own sacred texts? Some scholars suggested alternative explanations. Maybe Qumran was a pottery workshop. Maybe it was a winter estate. Maybe the caves served as a kind of religious storage site where worn-out texts from many communities were brought to rest. These ideas existed, but nobody had hard scientific proof. The Essene theory kept standing simply because nothing could knock it down convincingly enough. Then, in 2012, at a lunch table at Tel Aviv University, a molecular biologist named Oded Rechavi sat down with a biblical scholar named Noam Mizrahi. The conversation moved toward the scrolls and the maddening difficulty of matching thousands of tiny, disconnected fragments. Mizrahi explained that matching pieces relied on handwriting comparisons and educated guesswork. Rechavi listened and then asked one question: what are the scrolls actually made of? Mizrahi said, parchment, animal skin. Rechavi paused and said something that opened an entirely new area of scientific inquiry. Parchment has DNA. Nobody had ever thought to look for it there. Rechavi specialized in ancient DNA analysis. This method had already been used to trace human migration patterns across tens of thousands of years of prehistory. But no one had pointed it at a manuscript before. He realized the same science could be applied to scripture itself. Together with Nina Shore, the curator of the Dead Sea Scrolls at the Israel Antiquities Authority, the team spent years working out how to do this without touching the texts themselves. The scrolls are irreplaceable. You cannot cut them. You cannot drill into them. So how do you get genetic material from something you are not allowed to touch? The answer was sitting inside the storage boxes the entire time. Decades of careful handling had left behind fine particles of parchment dust settling quietly at the bottom of the containers. That dust held collagen, the structural protein from animal skin, and locked inside it was ancient genetic material. By collecting dust from blank margins and worn edges, places where no text had ever been written, the team could gather enough material to work with, without ever touching the writing itself. To me, that is one of the most elegant solutions I have ever heard of in any scientific field. The evidence had been accumulating in those boxes for decades, right alongside the scholars who never thought to look at it. The actual extraction process was brutal. Making parchment involves soaking, scraping, stretching, and drying animal skin. That process damages DNA at a molecular level before the scroll is even written on. Then the iron-based inks used on many scrolls are chemically corrosive and damage the material further. Then add 2,000 years in desert caves. Then add 70 years of handling by hundreds of researchers, each one potentially leaving behind modern DNA contamination. The team worked in specialized ancient DNA labs that looked more like hospital clean rooms than archives. Full protective suits, controlled air pressure, ultraviolet sterilization. They built strict protocols to confirm that what they were reading was genuinely ancient and not contamination from modern hands. They ran each sample through multiple independent extractions and checked results between separate laboratories. It took years and hundreds of samples, but eventually they had reliable genetic sequences from dozens of fragments. Most results confirmed what you would expect: sheepskin, standard material used across ancient Judea. Sheep survive in harsh desert environments. They need minimal water. They can graze on tough vegetation. Finding sheepskin at Qumran made complete sense. But then a small group of fragments came back as something different: cowhide. And that single result is where the whole 70-year theory started to fall apart. Here is why cowhide is so significant. Qumran sits in one of the harshest desert environments on the planet. Sheep and goats can survive there. Cattle simply cannot. A single cow needs dozens of gallons of water every day, and substantial grazing land to live, let alone thrive. There was no version of any community at Qumran that could have also raised cattle nearby. Cowhide at Qumran was not just unusual, it was physically impossible to produce locally. Any scroll written on cowhide had to have been made somewhere else entirely, somewhere wetter, somewhere greener, somewhere much further away. That meant those scrolls had traveled to Qumran. They had not been written there. The Essene theory said the scrolls were a local collection produced by a local community. Cowhide proved that at least some of them were not local at all. What I think makes this even more significant is where the cowhide clustered. It was not scattered randomly. It appeared around specific texts. Most notably, the shorter version of the book of Jeremiah was written on cowhide. The longer, more familiar version was written on sheepskin. Different animals, almost certainly different regions, different scribal communities, producing different versions of the same book. This was not one text slowly drifting apart through copying errors. These were two genuinely separate textual traditions that developed independently in two different places. The confirmed finding from the 2020 publication of this research is this: the shorter Jeremiah and the longer Jeremiah came from separate communities in separate geographic locations. Two different Bibles, existing at the same time, treated as equally authoritative by whoever kept them. Before this genetic research, that idea existed as a theory. Now it exists as confirmed physical fact, written into the DNA of the parchment itself. The team also applied this analysis to other texts. The Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice is a liturgical text describing angelic worship in a heavenly temple. Copies were found both at Qumran and at Masada, the mountain fortress where Jewish rebels made their last stand against Rome in 73 CE. The DNA showed that multiple Qumran fragments of this same text came from entirely different animals. This text was not the guarded property of one isolated sect. It was widely copied and independently produced in multiple places. It was popular across the broader Jewish world of that era. The kinship analysis added another dimension entirely. By looking at nuclear DNA markers, researchers could sometimes identify parchments that came from closely related animals, siblings or members of the same flock. Groups of related animals pointed toward specific production centers. Several scrolls made from locally sourced skins in the same short window of time showed up in clusters. But here is the detail that matters. Some of those tightly related clusters, clearly made together from one flock, turned up mixed in among fragments from completely unrelated animals and entirely different flocks. That pattern does not fit a collection grown naturally from one central location. It fits a collection assembled from many different places over many different periods of time. What all of this points toward is something scholars had speculated about, but could never prove before. These caves most likely functioned as what Jewish tradition calls a geniza, a sacred storage space for texts too holy to throw away, but no longer usable in daily worship. Jewish law forbids discarding any document that bears the divine name. Worn out or damaged texts must be respectfully preserved. Communities across ancient Judea maintained designated spaces for exactly this purpose. Qumran, just 20 miles from Jerusalem by the standards of ancient travel, would have been reachable when Rome laid siege to Jerusalem between 68 and 70 CE. People fleeing that destruction may have carried whatever sacred scrolls they could rescue out into the desert. Adding them to materials other communities had already been depositing there for generations. Family scrolls, synagogue scrolls, fragments of an entire world being saved as everything familiar collapsed. To me, that picture is staggering. These caves were not the private library of one group. They were a shared sacred archive for an entire civilization. And the cowhide fragments confirm that materials were physically traveling from wetter regions in the north or west down into the Judean wilderness. This was not a closed community guarding its own private collection. It was a network. Multiple communities exchanging texts across real geographic distances. The implications for understanding the origins of early Christianity are genuinely significant. The confirmed picture the DNA gives us is of a Jewish world in the 1st century that was not theologically uniform. Multiple communities existed. Multiple versions of Scripture were maintained. The process of deciding which version was authoritative, what scholars call canonization, was not finished. It was still actively happening, still contested, still unresolved. And the DNA has now proven that fact physically, not just as a theory, as hard evidence in the genetic material of ancient animal skin. The research, published in 2020, opened questions nobody could even ask before. Can scientists now identify specific production centers for individual scrolls? Can they map the entire geographic network of ancient Jewish scribal communities? Can they trace in physical detail how texts moved between regions over decades or centuries? Researchers are already working on this. The current effort involves expanding DNA analysis to a much larger number of fragments, pairing that genetic data with multispectral imaging that can recover text invisible to the naked eye, and building reference databases of ancient animal DNA from across the ancient Near East. The goal is a geographic map precise enough that a fragment could tell you roughly where in the ancient world the animal behind it once lived. What I take away from all of this is that the Dead Sea Scrolls are not what scholars thought they were for 7 decades. They are not the theological statement of one radical sect. The confirmed picture now is that they represent the accumulated sacred literature of ancient Israel as a whole, gathered piece by piece over generations, diverse, contested, and very human in their contradictions. Multiple voices, multiple communities, multiple versions of the Bible, each one treated as authoritative by whoever kept it. And here is what I find most remarkable of all. None of this required breaking anything open. None of it required touching the writing. It required reading the dust sitting quietly at the bottom of storage boxes for 70 years. The information was always there. It just needed someone to ask the right question. So for me, the main thing I understand now is this. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not a single community's private archive. They are a shared library from an entire civilization. And the DNA hiding in the dust proved it. The question was never just what the scrolls say. The question that actually changed history was what the scrolls are made of.